Hello, and welcome to 3-Minute History with Mr. Marr. Quick summaries about a range of different history topics. Today we're going back to look at an event which was very prominent in the Atlantic slave trade, and that was the abolition of the slave trade, certainly at least by Britain. For many years there had been prominent campaigns against the slave trade. This had not only been by people in Britain, but also many of the people who had once themselves been slaves. Within Britain, some of the prominent campaigners included people like William Wilberforce. He was an MP who over a number of years introduced bills to try and end the slave trade. Another example was Thomas Clarkson. Clarkson not only set up an anti-slavery campaign group, but he was prominently involved in doing the research by visiting ships and ports throughout Britain and finding evidence of some of the different tools that were used to control and indeed torture African people on board the slave ships. Many Africans that had been part of the slave trade as well also had a prominent role in campaigning against the trade. They established their own anti-slavery groups, such as the Sons of Africa, and would often take part in public speeches around Britain, telling people about the evils of the trade. And they also did things such as produce newsletters and write letters. All of this had a significant role in encouraging people across Britain to campaign against the trade. There were other factors that led to the abolition of the slave trade as well. One of these was certainly the slave rebellions, where slaves on the plantations would fight back against their owners or destroy crops. And this not only made it extremely difficult to carry out the work, but it also made it economically unviable. The growth of trade between Britain and other parts of the empire and the world, including India, also meant that many of the products slaves were growing could be got cheaper for elsewhere, and much of this encouraged more people then to come around to the idea of abolishing the slave trade. It's worth noting though that there were many prominent people who were against Britain ending the slave trade. They used a variety of arguments, not least the fear of economic woes that they believed would occur. They suggested that unemployment would rocket in many of the locations across Britain that had come to rely on the trade, including Bristol and Liverpool. Many of them also suggested that Britain would face military problems too. Traditionally, the British Navy had benefited from Britain's role in the slave trade. Not only had it made raised taxes which could be used to fund much of the Navy, it also gave sailors experience on board ships. All of this at a time when Britain was engaged in wars with France would worry people that ending the slave trade would leave Britain at a huge disadvantage. In spite of this, however, in 1807 the Slave Trade Act was passed. This meant that it was now illegal to engage in the slave trade itself within any part of the British Empire. British ships could no longer go to Africa and kidnap the Africans and take them to the Americas and force them to work. This was to be enforced by the Royal Navy, and indeed any ships that were caught with slaves on board were subject to fines, although this often resulted in ships realizing they were about to be caught and throwing the slaves overboard. It's worth noting though that whilst the Slave Trade Act of 1807 did make it illegal for British people to engage in the slave trade, it did not end slavery. Not only did other countries continue with this, but it was still perfectly legal for British people in parts of the British Empire to keep the slaves that they had. They simply could no longer add to this by continuing to kidnap Africans.